The old man smelled of dust and several seasons of the city's harsh, unforgiving exhaust. He stood at the towering iron gates of the Blackwood estate in Chicago, his hands steady as they gripped a small, weather-beaten cardboard sign. Around him, the air was thick with the scent of high-octane fuel from idling limousines and the sharp, metallic cold of a Lake Michigan wind. Hundreds of guests swept past him, a relentless tide of silk gowns and hand-stitched Italian leather shoes. They carried with them the heavy, cloying fragrance of expensive perfume and the bright, artificial sound of practiced laughter. Not one of them slowed their pace to acknowledge the shadow at the gate. Not one of them looked at his face, choosing instead to treat him as a glitch in the landscape, a piece of urban debris that had somehow drifted into the zip code of the gods. The security guards watched from the periphery with the practiced, predatory patience of men paid to make inconveniences disappear without a sound. They did not move yet. They simply waited for the order to erase him. His name was Ezekiel Crowe. He was in his late 60s, though the elements had carved a deeper history into his skin than his years alone suggested. A thick, unkempt white beard covered his jaw, and short gray hair clung to his temples like ash. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, the fabric so thin it looked like it might dissolve in the next gust of wind. His shoes were little more than leather husks with no soles left, leaving the freezing pavement of the driveway to bite at the bottoms of his feet. He had not eaten since the previous morning, and his stomach responded with low, hollow sounds that were swallowed by the growl of arriving engines. He sat down slowly against the cold stone pillar of the gate, his movements stiff, but lacking the tremor of the weak. He folded his cardboard sign and pressed it flat against his chest, closing his eyes as if the opulence before him was merely a dream he had already finished dreaming. Inside the Blackwood Manor, the reality was a violent contrast of light and warmth. 300 guests moved beneath chandeliers that dropped from the vaulted ceilings like frozen waterfalls of crystal. Every place setting featured heavy silver and glasses that rang with a pure, expensive tone when struck. This was the inner sanctum of the city's most feared power brokers, a room that smelled of aged bourbon, white roses, and the particular, suffocating heat of people who had never once doubted their right to own everything they saw. The man at the center of this gravity was Adrian Blackwood, but the shadow standing beside him was Viktor Draven. Draven was broad-shouldered with a jaw like carved stone and eyes that moved through the ballroom the way searchlights move through a thick fog. He missed nothing. He moved with a terrifying certainty, and the room responded to him with the instinctive, trembling silence that rooms always offer to men who deal in absolute consequences. Viktor had a private habit, a dark game he played with Adrian and their circle of associates, Lucien Voss and Marcus Hale. They made bets, cruel, specific wagers about the limits of human dignity. They would predict how far a man would sink for a chance at survival, then watch the descent with the clinical detachment of gods watching insects. Tonight, the game had already begun. Lucien Voss, always the one looking for the next laugh, leaned close to Viktor's ear. He whispered about the old man sitting against the gate, the one with the white beard and the cardboard sign. Lucien thought it would be a masterpiece of entertainment to bring the beggar inside, to seat him at the center of the gala, and watch the faces of the elite as the smell of the street mingled with their vintage wine. Viktor went very still, the way he always did when an idea genuinely interested him. He lifted his glass, the amber liquid catching the light of the chandeliers. His lips curved into something that was almost a smile, though it carried no warmth. He gave the order to bring the man in, not to feed him or provide charity, but to clean him up just enough to be presentable for the theater. He wanted to see how his guests would react to a man who had nothing, and he wanted to see if that man still knew how to fear. 2 security men went out into the cold and found Ezekiel still sitting against the wall. When they told him he had been invited inside as a guest, Ezekiel opened his eyes slowly. He looked from one guard to the other without speaking, his sharp, focused gaze moving between them with a directness that made the younger guard hesitate. It was the look of a man who had learned long ago that sudden kindness from strangers was usually the prelude to a different kind of pain. He nodded once and stood up. His knees popped with the sound of old wood, but his back was straight. As he was led through the iron gates and into the blinding light of the lobby, he did not look at the gold or the marble. He walked like a man who was not entering a palace, but returning to a battlefield he had never truly left. Adrian Blackwood stood at the center of the ballroom, his silhouette framed by the amber glow of 1,000 candles. He was a man of 40, possessing a face that was handsome in a way that felt predatory, all sharp angles and eyes that calculated the net worth of every person they landed upon. Beside him, Viktor Draven remained a silent monolith, his presence exerting a gravitational pull that caused guests to instinctively adjust their posture as they approached. Viktor was the shadow to Adrian's light, the silent partner who didn't need to speak to be the most dangerous man in Chicago. Between them stood Tico, a man whose round face was perpetually creased with a mirth that rarely reached his eyes. Tico lived for the small, cruel entertainments that wealth provided when everything else became boring. He leaned in, his voice a low, oily conspiratorial whisper, and told them of the old man he had seen at the iron gates, the one with the white beard and the cardboard sign pressed against a chest that had forgotten the weight of a full meal. Tico's proposition was simple: bring the beggar inside. Not as an act of charity, but as a living piece of performance art. He suggested they seat the man at table 7, right in the center of the elite, to watch the chemical reaction of high society when forced to breathe the same air as a man who owned nothing. It was a bet on human behavior, a wager to see how long the polished guests could maintain their veneer of civility before their disgust broke through. Adrian's lips curved into a thin, bloodless smile. He looked at Viktor, seeking the silent nod of the man who truly held the keys to the city. Viktor went still, his eyes narrowing as he turned a vintage wine glass slowly between his fingers. The idea genuinely interested him, not because he cared for the joke, but because he enjoyed the study of power and its absence. He gave a microscopic nod, a silent permission that set the machinery in motion. Adrian summoned his head of security with a flick of his wrist. His instructions were precise. They were to bring the man in, but they were not to feed him at the door or offer him the easy exit of a few $100s. They were to take him to the back office, find him a shirt from the lost and found that wasn't too tattered, and seat him at table 7 without a word of explanation to the other guests. He wanted to watch the guests rearrange themselves around the old man like water moving around a stone in a river, slowly, silently, and without acknowledgement. Outside, the security guards found Ezekiel Crowe exactly where he had been, a shadow against the stone pillar. When they told him he was being invited inside as a guest of Mr. Blackwood, Ezekiel didn't look surprised. He didn't look grateful. He looked at them with a quiet, unhurried attention that was entirely different from the way everyone else in the room would soon be looking at him. He stood up, his old knees protesting the movement, and followed them into the warmth. In the hotel lobby, a staff member produced a white shirt that had been left behind months ago. It was several sizes too large for Ezekiel's thin, weathered frame, but he put it on without complaint, tucking it into his torn trousers as best he could. Someone found a pair of old loafers to replace his soulless shoes, and a woman with a sympathetic face combed his white hair back from his forehead. Even in borrowed clothes that didn't fit, Ezekiel didn't shuffle. He walked through the lobby and into the ballroom with a directness that made the security guards feel like they were the ones being escorted. When he was seated at table 7, the reaction was immediate and entirely silent. A woman in a gold dress shifted her chair 3 inches to the left without realizing she had done it. A man in a gray suit checked his phone, suddenly fascinated by a blank screen. Across the room, from his vantage point at the head table, Adrian watched. He watched the careful way Ezekiel's hands moved on the table as he unfolded his napkin. He watched the waiter pause for just a second too long before deciding to fill the old man's glass. Viktor Draven, however, watched something else. He watched the old man's eyes. They weren't darting around in fear or wide with wonder at the crystal waterfalls above. They moved around the room with a calm, intentional focus, as if he were checking a ledger he had written long ago. Ezekiel didn't look like a beggar being mocked. He looked like a man who had finally found the person he had been looking for across 15 years of exile. The reaction at table 7 was immediate and entirely silent. As Ezekiel Crowe took his seat, the air seemed to thin, occupied by the small, rapid eye movements of people trying to hold a conversation without words. A woman in a gold dress shifted her chair very slightly to the left, a reflexive distance created without her even seeming to realize she had done it. Beside her, a man in a sharp gray suit pointedly checked his phone, while another woman offered Ezekiel the tight, closed smile people produce when they do not know what expression their face is supposed to make. Ezekiel did not seem to notice the wall of discomfort rising around him. With movements that were steady and deliberate, he unfolded his crisp linen napkin and placed it carefully across his lap. He looked at the array of silver and crystal before him, 4 forks at every setting, 3 glasses, and the heavy weight of expectations. From across the ballroom, Adrian Blackwood and Viktor Draven watched the scene unfold with the precise attention of men who had spent decades studying how people behave when they think the cost of bad behavior is low. Adrian's inner circle was already laughing softly to themselves, enjoying the sight of the water moving around the stone. But the stone did not behave as they expected. Ezekiel ate slowly and did not rush. He did not reach across the table or pile food onto his plate in a desperate frenzy. Instead, he took small portions and chewed with a great, unhurried care that lacked even a flicker of embarrassment. His eyes moved across the room with a quiet, direct attention that was completely different from the voyeuristic stares of everyone else. He looked at the chandeliers above him for a long moment, the light reflecting in his sharp, focused eyes as if he were seeing something beautiful he had not encountered in a very long time. The silence at the table was eventually broken by Marcus Hale, a property developer whose voice carried a clipped, polite, but clearly dismissive edge. He turned to Ezekiel and asked how, exactly, he had come to attend such an exclusive event. Ezekiel looked at him calmly, his expression controlled and unsettlingly confident. He answered simply that he had been invited. Marcus made a small sound in the back of his throat, not quite agreement, but not quite a challenge, and turned back to his plate, unable to find the crack in the old man's armor. While the woman in the gold dress continued to talk with great animation to the guest on her opposite side, pointedly ignoring the man in the borrowed shirt, someone else was watching. A young journalist named Sae, assigned to Table 7 to cover the gala's financial prestige, had noticed Ezekiel the moment he sat down. She saw the shirt that was several sizes too large. She saw the careful, deliberate distances the others maintained. But more than that, she felt a quality in the old man's stillness that she could not immediately name. Leaning forward, Sae poured water into Ezekiel's glass without being asked. He looked at her and thanked her quietly, his voice deep and clear. When she introduced herself and asked if he was enjoying the evening, he looked at her with a directness that surprised her. He told her the food was very good and that the chandeliers reminded him of a government building he had seen in his youth, back when he held his first real job. He spoke the words before everything changed simply, without any drama, and then returned his focus to his plate. Sae set her pen down slowly on the tablecloth, her journalistic instincts beginning to hum. Across the room, Adrian was not yet concerned. He was busy accepting congratulations from a Swiss banker, convinced the evening was going exactly as planned. He did not notice that Ezekiel Crowe was no longer looking at the chandeliers. The old man's gaze had settled on the head table, locked onto the men who had invited him in as a joke, his presence a silent power that had already begun to shift the gravity of the room. Viktor Draven did not lead by shouting. He led by observing the minute shifts in a room's atmosphere, the way a predator senses a change in the wind. From the head table, he watched the socialites at Table 7 perform their elaborate dance of avoidance around Ezekiel Crowe. Adrian Blackwood was still leaning back, a smirk playing on his lips as he whispered to Lucien Voss about the success of their little experiment, but Viktor had stopped listening to the banter. His wine glass remained midair, frozen, as his focus narrowed entirely on the old man in the oversized white shirt. There was something in the way Ezekiel held his silverware, not with the fumbling desperation of the starved, but with the muscle memory of someone who had once commanded rooms much larger than this one. Viktor watched the old man's eyes as they moved across the crystal chandeliers and the 12-piece orchestra. They weren't the eyes of a tourist. They were the eyes of an owner. A cold, Prickling sensation began at the base of Viktor's neck, a biological alarm he hadn't felt in 15 years. Beside him, Tico was still chuckling, pointing out how the woman in the gold dress was practically hanging off the edge of her chair to avoid contact with Ezekiel. Viktor's jaw tightened, the bone appearing like carved stone beneath his skin. He leaned forward, his shadow falling across the silk-covered table, and silenced Tico with a single, sideways glance. He wasn't looking at the torn trousers or the borrowed shoes anymore. He was looking through them. Viktor reached into the mental archive he kept of every man he had ever broken, every partner he had ever outmaneuvered, and every ghost he thought he had buried in the foundations of his empire. A name began to form in the back of his mind, one associated with a massive, devastating collapse, a secret that had been the silent architect of his own wealth. He remembered a pair of eyes from a decade and a half ago, eyes that had possessed that same unsettling, intentional focus before the world tore them away. Across the room at table 7, Sae, the journalist, was leaning in closer to Ezekiel, her pen poised over her notebook. Viktor saw the shift in her expression, the way her professional detachment was being replaced by a visible, creeping shock. He saw Ezekiel nod once, a slow, full, deliberate movement that carried more weight than a confession. At that moment, the old man looked up. His gaze traveled across the expanse of the ballroom, ignoring the hundreds of wealthy guests, and locked directly onto Viktor Draven. It was not a look of plea or of anger. It was a look of recognition. It was the stare of a man who had been carrying a history inside him for 15 years and had finally arrived at the doorstep where it belonged. Viktor felt his hand on the table curl into a fist. The beggar wasn't a prop and a joke. He was a witness to a crime that Viktor had spent a lifetime pretending never happened. The air in the ballroom seemed to grow heavy, the music of the orchestra suddenly feeling discordant and thin. Adrian noticed the change in Viktor, the way his partner had gone from amused observer to a man prepared for a siege. The laughter at the head table died away, replaced by a sudden, sharp tension that radiated outward, silencing the tables nearest to them one by one. Viktor didn't turn to Adrian. He didn't call for security. He simply watched as Ezekiel Crowe set his spoon down with clinical precision and began to push his chair back from the table. The shadow of the Mafia boss had met the shadow of the past, and for the first time in his adult life, Viktor Draven felt the ground beneath his empire begin to rot. The dessert course had barely been cleared when the master of ceremonies, a man polished to a mirror shine named Rez, stepped to the front podium. He announced that the floor was now open for any guest who wished to share a few words, a Rexton tradition that usually produced nothing but forgettable pleasantries from board members and loyal clients. Adrian Blackwood leaned back, his fingers tracing the rim of his crystal glass, expecting the same safe ritual that had anchored this gala for years. At table 7, Ezekiel Crowe did not wait for an introduction. He stood up slowly, the movement possessed of a quiet, unhurried dignity that pushed his heavy chair back against the polished floor with a distinctive, grounding scrape. Every head at his table turned at once, the socialites frozen in a mid-breath realization that the joke was no longer sitting down. Rez, standing at the microphone, paused visibly as he saw the old man in the oversized white shirt beginning to walk toward the front. His eyes darted instinctively toward the head table, seeking the silent command of the men who truly owned the room. Viktor Draven was already watching, his expression of earlier amusement entirely replaced by a hard, clinical focus. He gave Rez a nod so small it was almost imperceptible, the permission of a man who wanted to see exactly how deep this grave went. As Ezekiel walked, a strange phenomenon took hold of the ballroom. He did not shuffle or move with the uncertainty of a trespasser. He walked like a man who had once known exactly what it felt like to have every eye in a full room tracking his shadow. Conversations died away table by table as he passed them, the silence spreading like an ink stain across a silk tablecloth. The 12-piece orchestra, sensing the shift in the room's gravity, let their final notes taper off into nothingness. By the time Ezekiel reached the podium and placed both hands firmly on its edge, the silence was absolute. The chandeliers threw a still, unforgiving light across 240 faces that were now all turned toward the front, unable to classify the man standing before them. Ezekiel's voice, when it finally broke the stillness, was deep and clear, carrying without effort to the furthest corners of the hall. He began by thanking his host for the invitation, his tone as polished as the silver on the tables. A few people near the front exchanged sharp, confused glances, unsettled by the refined texture of a voice they expected to be broken. He said his name was Ezekiel Crowe, and that he had come a very long way to stand in this room tonight. He told them he hadn't just come from the iron gates outside, though that was physically true. He had come from a different life entirely. He spoke of a version of himself that a number of people in that room might already be familiar with, a name from a history they had all agreed to forget. He reached into his pocket and removed the folded cardboard sign he had carried all evening. He placed it face down on the podium, its secret hidden for just a few moments longer. He looked directly across the expanse of the room, his sharp eyes locking onto Viktor Draven and Adrian Blackwood with the unwavering stare of a man who had spent 15 years in the wilderness preparing for this single, unhurried breath. He told the room he had learned something by losing every single thing he owned and surviving it alone in the cast-off clothing of strangers, and that it would take only a few minutes to share the weight of it. The room held its collective breath. The elite sat motionless, trapped in the orbit of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to reveal. The uninvited voice had arrived, and the silence it left in its wake was louder than any music the orchestra could have played. Ezekiel Crowe leaned into the microphone, the metallic hum of the sound system the only noise in a room where 200 people had forgotten how to breathe. He did not look at the cardboard sign yet. Instead, he looked at the high-backed chairs where Adrian Blackwood and Viktor Draven sat like statues carved from ice. He told a room that he had once sat at tables exactly like these, in rooms where the light was just as golden and the wine just as old. He had run a company, not a small one, and he spoke its name into the microphone with a clarity that acted like a physical blow to the men at the head table. He watched the reactions spread through the front rows like a slow-moving fire. He watched a woman near the center aisle set her fork down so slowly it seemed she was afraid it might shatter against the china. The name he had spoken was attached to a collapse that had occurred 15 years ago, a massive, devastating ruin that had destroyed the lives of 30,000 families across 4 countries. It had been labeled the largest private investment fraud the region had ever seen, a scandal that had supposedly ended when the man at the center of it disappeared before the first formal charges could even be filed. Ezekiel did not look ashamed, nor did he look proud. He looked like a man who had been carrying a mountain for 15 years and had finally decided to set it down on the ballroom floor. He described the fund not as a theft from the beginning, but as something that started with a genuine belief in helping ordinary people invest their small savings. He spoke of the first 3 years when it truly worked, when he was photographed with ministers and governors, and when he attended galas exactly like this one. Then, his voice shifted, becoming as clinical as a doctor describing the stages of a terminal illness. He told them how the returns began to dry up, not because of a plan, but because of a market correction he had ignored in his chase for larger investors and larger numbers. He admitted that he had made promises he could not keep and that, instead of stopping, he had made more promises to cover the old ones. He said the words, "I crossed the line," plainly, without any attempt to soften the edges of his crime. He described the deliberate choice he made to keep the appearance of a healthy fund while the foundation underneath it rotted away, using new money to pay old debts until 30,000 families lost everything they had ever worked for. The silence in the grand orison was no longer the silence of curiosity. It was the silence of a courtroom. Ezekiel looked directly at Viktor Draven, whose hands were now flat on the silk-covered table, his face a color that the champagne light could not quite mask. Ezekiel told the room that while he had been the face of the collapse, he had not been the only one who profited from the rot. He spoke of a specific man who had known the fund was failing months before the public did, a man who had used that knowledge to ensure the collapse happened faster so he could strip the remaining assets for himself. He told them he had spent 12 years in exile, working in the shadows of foreign cities, not just to survive, but to find that specific man. He had listened for a name, followed a trail of numbers, and waited for the moment when power would be obligated to listen to a voice from the street. As he spoke, he saw the recognition in Viktor's eyes, a 15-year secret rising to the surface, like a ghost from a shallow grave. Ezekiel Crowe, the man they believed they had erased, was no longer a beggar at the gate. He was the ledger they had tried to burn, and tonight, he was calling every debt to account. Sight and start. Ezekiel's hand moved with a slow, deliberate grace as he reached for the crumpled document he had placed face down on the podium. Sight 147, 148. Sight and heart. The room felt as though it were tilted on its axis, the weight of his words pressing down on the silk-covered tables and the crystal waterfalls of the chandeliers. Sight 10, 135. Sight start. He did not smooth the paper out with a flourish. He handled it with the weary reverence of a man holding the only surviving piece of his own soul. Sight 109. Sight and heart. This was the evidence he had carried through 3 countries and 12 years of exile, the paper that had stayed pressed against his chest while he slept on the hot pavement outside the iron gates. Sight 7, 9, 201. Sight and start. He began to describe the contents of the brown envelope he had kept hidden in his jacket, a collection of records that no one in the Grand Orison was prepared to hear. Sight 209, 210, 211. Sight start. His voice remained deep and unhurried, clinical in its precision as he detailed 11 specific wire transfer records. Sight 136, 212. Sight start. These were not mere numbers. They were the DNA of a betrayal. Sight 214. Sight start. He traced the path of the money from his collapsing fund to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, then into the hands of a private consultancy firm with no employees, no website, and no registered office. Sight 212, 217, 218. Sight and heart. The equivalent of $9 million had vanished into that void, extracted in the 18 months leading up to the public ruin of 30,000 families. Sight 213, 218. Sight and start. The silence in the ballroom was now so thin it felt as though it might shatter at the sound of a falling fork. Sight 280. Sight and start. Ezekiel looked at the paper in his hand, and then looked directly at the head table where Adrian Blackwood and Viktor Draven sat. Sight 153. Sight and heart. He read the name of the consultancy's sole registered director from memory, a name he had memorized in a small, rented room in a foreign city when he had nothing else to occupy his mind. Sight 219, 220. Sight start. It was a name that lived in the shadows of the Rexton Group, a name that connected the billionaire's polished gala to the dust of the streets. Sight 12, 224, 225. Sight and heart. He then described the second page of the evidence, a memorandum handwritten and bearing a signature that the men at the head table knew as well as their own. Sight 228, 229. Sight start. It was a document that advised on the precise, optimal timing of personal fund withdrawals, a guide on how to maximize private returns while the foundation of the fund rotted away. Sight 230, 231. Sight start. The memorandum was dated exactly 3 months before the collapse was announced to the world. Sight 231. Sight start. It was the proof that their empires were not built on vision or growth, but on the calculated theft of the futures of 30,000 families. Sight 117, 173, 176. Sight start. Viktor Draven's hands remained flat on the table, but his jaw was tight, his face devoid of its usual mask of certainty. Sight 206, 291. Sight and heart beside him. Adrian's amused expression had long since vanished, replaced by the recognition that the beggar at the gate had invited them into a cage of their own making. Sight 124, 251. Sight and heart. Ezekiel told the room that he had carried a copy of this document for 6 years, waiting for the breath and the standing to say these things out loud. Sight 232, 312. Sight and heart. He was no longer the man who had run away with nothing. He was the man who had come back to ensure that the truth was finally more expensive than the silence they had bought. Sight 197, 530, 578. Site_start. The crumpled paper was not just evidence of a legal crime, but of a human one, the betrayal of a specific and irreplaceable trust. Site 374, 375. Site_start. As Ezekiel stood at the podium, the room understood that the 15-year secret was no longer a secret, and the empires built upon it were now standing on ground that had completely rotted away. Site 173, 577. Viktor Draven's jaw was a jagged line of granite as he watched the reality of his carefully constructed life begin to dissolve into the champagne-colored light of the ballroom. For 15 years, he had operated on the assumption that power was a matter of who could shout the loudest or hit the hardest, but tonight, he was discovering that truth possessed a mass that physical force could not displace. He leaned forward, his hands pressing so hard into the silk tablecloth that the wood beneath groaned. With a voice that was low, controlled, and vibrating with a lethal edge, he gave the order his men had been waiting for. Two of his personal security detail, men built like fortress walls with eyes as empty as open graves, began to move toward the podium from the right side of the room. They were fast, covering half the distance of the dance floor before the first guest had even realized the performance was over. They moved with the clinical efficiency of men paid to make problems quietly disappear. But as they approached, Ezekiel Crowe did not flinch. He did not step back or reach for the edge of the podium in fear. Instead, he looked at the lead guard with a calm, unhurried recognition that acted like a physical barrier. Ezekiel spoke directly into the microphone, his voice remaining deep and clear, carrying to every corner of the ballroom. He told the guards and the room that he had expected this. He explained that the documents on the podium were not the only copies in existence. The originals were currently held by 3 separate individuals in 3 different countries, each with a specific set of instructions. If Ezekiel did not make a particular phone call by 8 o'clock the following morning, those individuals would simultaneously transmit the complete document package to 6 financial regulatory bodies and 4 major news organizations across 3 continents. The lead guard stopped. He stood in the center of the floor, caught in the vacuum between Viktor's lethal command and the old man's immovable certainty. The guard turned his head, a reflexive movement, looking back toward the head table for a new set of orders. In that moment of hesitation, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It began with a single woman at table 5, a private equity analyst who had spent the last 3 years as a client of the Rexton Group. She did not stand or shout. She simply reached into her evening bag, took out her phone, and held it level with the edge of the table. Within seconds, another phone appeared at a different table, then 3 more, then a dozen. It was not a coordinated act of rebellion, but a quiet, collective decision that what was happening in this room should not be allowed to disappear when the lights went out. Nola, the PR director, moved through the room with the frantic grace of someone trying to stop a dam from bursting. She leaned down to whisper in the ear of the woman at table 5, her voice a hissed warning about non-disclosure agreements and professional suicide. The woman looked at Nola, then looked at the old man at the podium, and slowly turned her phone screen up on the table, the recording light a steady, crimson heartbeat. Nola straightened and walked away, realizing the room had passed a threshold where her influence no longer held weight. Viktor Draven felt the air in the ballroom grow cold. He looked at the phones, hundreds of glowing rectangles held by people who were usually the most compliant members of a circle, and understood that the situation had already traveled beyond the walls of the Grand Horizon. He looked at Ezekiel, who stood as still as a mountain, and then he looked at his guards. With a very small, controlled shake of his head, he signaled them to stand down. The guards stepped back, the tension in the room exhaling in a long, collective breath. People who had been frozen in their seats began to push back their chairs, rising not to leave, but to see better. The silent power of the man in the borrowed white shirt had achieved what no lawyer or investigator ever could. He had turned a room full of concentrated power into a room full of witnesses, and for the first time in 15 years, the men who owned the city were the ones who were truly afraid. The silence that followed the retreat of the bodyguards was not a peaceful one. It was the heavy, pressurized stillness that precedes a structural collapse. Viktor Draven sat at the head table, his hands still flat against the silk, but the air of untouchable certainty that had defined him for 30 years was gone. He looked at the glowing rectangles of the phones held by his peers and understood, with the cold clarity of a drowning man, that the secret was no longer a ghost in a shallow grave. It was a broadcast. The internal collapse of the Rexton Group began not with a shout, but with a series of small, calculated movements. The Swiss banker, who had spent the early evening leaning into Viktor's orbit, shifted his chair back by several precise inches. It was a silent, professional excommunication, a signal to the rest of the room that the cost of proximity to Viktor Draven had just become too high. Lucien Voss, usually the first to find humor in the misfortunes of others, was no longer laughing. He looked at the crumpled document in Ezekiel's hand and then at Marcus Hale, and for the first time in 15 years, the shared history between them felt like a noose. Marcus, the man who had built his property empire on the bones of the fund's collapse, stared at his untouched dessert, his face a mask of pale, sweating realization. He had spent a decade and a half pressing against the truth, certain it would stay where he had pushed it, only to discover it had merely been waiting. The Mexican standoff Ezekiel had engineered was working with clinical efficiency. Sulo, a junior partner who had carried a fragment of this secret for 18 months, finally stood up. He walked across the floor, not toward the podium, but toward the exit where the hotel's head of security stood. He did not look at Viktor as he passed. He was a man with a mortgage and a family, and he had just decided that his loyalty to the firm did not extend to a sinking ship. Ezekiel watched this disintegration from the podium with a quiet, unhurried attention. He saw the way the guests at the main table began to rearrange themselves, moving away from the center of the rot like water avoiding a stone. He saw Nola, the architect of their public image, sitting paralyzed in a borrowed chair, her phone screen reflected in her eyes as she watched the story. She could no longer manage escape into the world. Adrian Blackwood, sensing the total evaporation of his authority, stood up to speak from his table, his voice controlled but carrying a sharp, desperate edge. He argued that this was not the appropriate forum for grievances, that legal channels were the only place for such performance art. But Ezekiel simply nodded, reminding the room that legal channels had been closed to the 30,000 families for 15 years because people like Adrian held the keys. The empire was not falling because of a riot. It was falling because the assumption of silence had been shattered. As more phones rose and more partners looked toward the doors, the concentrated power of the Rexton Group turned into a collection of individuals each making a private calculation for survival. Viktor Draven looked up at Ezekiel Crowe, the beggar he had invited in as a joke, and saw the face of his own ruin. The secret was out, and as the ballroom began its slow, chaotic dispersal, the men who had once owned the city realized they were standing in the middle of a room that was suddenly, terrifyingly empty of protection. Would you like me to finish the story with a final chapter, The Harbor of Truth, where Ezekiel finds his peace? By midnight, the Grand Orison was a hollowed-out shell of its former opulence, two-thirds empty and smelling of abandoned wine and the cold realization of ruin. The 12-piece orchestra had long since packed their instruments, leaving the vaulted hall to a silence that felt heavy and permanent. Ezekiel Crowe stood at the podium for a final moment, adjusting the borrowed white shirt with hands that no longer felt the phantom weight of the brown envelope. He did not wait for an apology from Adrian Blackwood, nor did he look for a sign of repentance on Viktor Draven's stone-carved face. He had learned during 15 years of exile that some things do not resolve, they only set down. He walked away from the microphone, his pace as unhurried and intentional as it had been when he entered. As he moved toward the exit, a few people who had remained, those who had stood to share their own stories of loss, silently followed him out. They did not speak as they crossed the marble lobby, but their presence was a form of keeping a person human, a collective exhale after a crossing that had lasted 15 years. Outside, the Chicago air was still sharp, but the iron gates no longer felt like a barrier. Ezekiel did not look back at the chandeliers or the frozen waterfalls of crystal that he had once thought defined his worth. He walked toward the waterfront, watching the low gold angle of the city lights reflecting off the dark water. He reached the small, rented room near the old port where he had been staying, a place where the landlord asked no questions and the silence was honest. On the narrow bed lay a single, creased photograph of a woman and 2 children, a remnant of the life he had destroyed and the family that no longer spoke his name. He sat in the single chair and made a cup of tea, the steam rising in the late-night quiet. For the first time in a decade and a half, he did not feel the need to check the locks or rehearse the numbers of the wire transfers in his head. The truth had been expensive, and it had not come cheaply to the person saying it, but it had finally been spoken in a room where power was obligated to listen. Across the city, the elite he had left behind were beginning their own private reckonings. Viktor Draven sat in his dark kitchen, the sequence of his life no longer holding together as it once had. Adrian Blackwood stood at his bathroom mirror, finding for the first time in 30 years that his face was not the correct tool for the moment he was in. The 15-year secret was now a matter of public record, and the 30,000 families were no longer mere statistics in a regulatory filing. They were people again. Ezekiel finished his tea and lay down. He did not dream of the gala or the cardboard sign. He listened to the sound of the boats and the water moving through the thin window, a rhythmic, grounding reality that outlasted any chandelier. He closed his eyes and, for the first time in 15 years, he slept through the entire night, reaching the harbor at the end of a very long crossing. The late afternoon light came across the floor at a low gold angle, filling the small room near the old port with a warmth Ezekiel hadn't felt in 15 years. He woke not to the jarring sound of sirens or the gnawing anxiety of the envelope pressing against his chest, but to the rhythmic, honest sound of boats and water moving through the thin window. For the first time since the collapse, he had slept through the entire night. He moved to the corner of the room, where a small electric kettle sat on a wooden crate. As the water began to hum, he looked at the narrow bed where a single, creased photograph of his wife and children lay. His wife was gone now, having passed away during his 4th year of exile, and though his children had not spoken to him in years, a new message sat on his phone. One from his daughter that was longer than 2 sentences. He did not share what it said, but he had already read it many times. Ezekiel stepped out onto the small balcony, carrying a steaming cup of tea. The air smelled of salt and the turning tide, a stark contrast to the dust and exhaust of the Chicago gates. He watched the boats move in and out of the port with a quiet, unhurried attention. He was no longer a man running without dignity. He was a man who had finally reached a harbor after a very long crossing. In his jacket pocket, where the evidence of the $9 million fraud had once lived, there was now only a folded letter from a woman in Dakar. She had lost everything in his collapse, yet she had written to tell him that she had finally forgiven him. He touched the paper through the fabric, feeling the weight of it, a weight that didn't pull him down, but anchored him. The sun climbed higher, reflecting off the water in a way that outshone any chandelier he had ever sat beneath. Ezekiel took a slow sip of his tea and looked out at the horizon. He was getting there,